I have never told anyone the 3 words my husband said to me at a funeral in 1973. I was 28, a young mother of 2, married to an elder for 10 years. We were in the Kingdom Hall, in the metal folding chairs, at the funeral of a sister I had loved, and Raymond leaned over and said 3 words, very quietly, the way a man shares something holy. For 50 years, I believed I knew what they meant. I was wrong. I am 80 now, and I have only lately understood what he was truly telling me that afternoon, and why. It was not comfort. It was not grief. It was the whole of headship folded into 3 words and spoken over a coffin, and I did not have the ears to hear it until almost everyone in this story was gone. I am going to tell you those 3 words. I promise you I will. But if I say them now, before you understand the room I was sitting in, and the woman in that coffin, and the man beside me who loved me in the only language he was given, they will sound like nothing at all. So you will have to wait a little while, the way I waited 50 years. Stay in the room with me if you can. Not for me. Subscribe so the next woman who needs this can find it. And if you have ever sat beside a good man in a quiet room and felt a chill you could not explain and were ashamed of it, tell me in the comments. I spent a long time believing I was the only one. In 1973, I had been Raymond Hartwell's wife for 10 years, though no one in the congregation ever called me by his first name. To them, I was Sister Hartwell, and he was Brother Hartwell, and we were, I think, exactly what a young couple in the truth was meant to look like. Raymond had been appointed an elder the year before, when the body of elders replaced the old congregation servant arrangement. He was 33. He was certain of everything, and he was gentle in the way that only a very certain man can afford to be. I was 28. I had a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and a clapboard house on Chestnut Street that I kept the way the society taught a sister to keep a house, which is to say the way you tend a thing that is only borrowed, because the end was coming, and coming soon. Those were the years they told us the world would end in 1975. I need you to understand what that teaching does to a young mother. You do not buy the good coat. You do not put money by. You do not let your little girl say out loud what she might want to be when she grows up, because there will be no growing up. There will only be the new world and the burning of this one. We lived, every one of us, in a house with no future tense. I held my breath for an entire decade, and I called the breathlessness faith. I was not left to learn that house on my own. From the first week of my marriage, my mother-in-law Edith came to me every Friday. She was a baptized sister, respected by everyone, and she had been handed the same training 40 years before by a woman who had been handed it before her. She inspected my home, my cooking, my field service hours, my spirit. She taught me a wife's place the way you teach a child her letters, patiently and without any doubt that there was only one alphabet. And it was in those years that I made the little card I kept in the back of my Bible. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, in my own handwriting. Wives, be in subjection to your husbands. I did not yet know I would spend the next 30 years handing that verse to other frightened young women, the way it had been handed to me. There was a sister in our congregation then. I will give you only her first name, because her first name is the only part of her the organization let me keep. Her name was Ruth. She was perhaps 20 years older than I was, married to a brother named Harold, who was hard the way the weather is hard, without meaning anything by it. Ruth had a low, steady voice and hands that were never still, and she had been in the truth since before the war. When I came to Mifflinburg at 18, frightened and newly married and inspected every Friday, it was Ruth who would find me at the back of the Kingdom Hall by the literature counter and stand near me, not saying much, just standing, so that I was not standing alone. She never once told me to leave. She would not have known how, but she stood near me, and at 18 that was the nearest thing to kindness I knew. Ruth never complained. That was the whole of how the congregation described her, and they meant it as the highest thing a woman could be. She bore what Harold was. She bore the field service in the cold mornings, the magazine bag worn soft against her hip, the report slip filled out faithful every month for 40 years. She bore a son who left the truth and was disfellowshipped, and she shunned him the way she was told to, and she never spoke his name again. I watched her do it. I thought it was strength. Now let me step back from that afternoon and show you the machine, because the machine is the whole of it, and without it, 3 words are only 3 words. You have to understand what a funeral was inside the truth. It was not in the way the world means it, about the person who had died. We do not believe the dead are anywhere. We believe they are asleep, unconscious, waiting in the ground for the resurrection. And so a funeral in the Kingdom Hall is not a goodbye. It is a meeting. It is a talk given by an elder, with the magazines and the scriptures, and the deceased is mentioned briefly near the end as an example. That was the word that was always used, an example. The body in the room was a lesson the living were meant to study, and the lesson, for a woman, was always the same. Headship is the doctrine, and you must hear how total it is. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the congregation, and there is no corner of a married woman's life it does not reach. Her body is not her own, the publications told us plainly, quoting Paul. Her time is not her own. Her doubts are not hers to speak. To submit was not one virtue among many. It was the only virtue a sister truly had, the one from which all the others were said to flow. And the proof of it, the visible proof, was that she did not complain. A complaining sister was a spiritually weak sister. A silent sister was a faithful one. The silence was the evidence, and behind the silence stood the whole apparatus, so that no sister forgot what the silence was for. There was the back room of the Kingdom Hall, with its single table, where 3 elders could sit as a judicial committee and decide whether a person remained a person. There was the rule that a wife's word alone was rarely enough, that serious things required 2 witnesses, which meant a woman could carry a wound for years with no standing to name it. There was the shunning, total and mandatory, that waited for anyone who stepped out of line, so that obedience was never only a feeling, it was a fence with the whole of your family on the inside of it. And over all of it were the publications of the society, which we were taught were spiritual food at the proper time, the voice of Jehovah's own organization, not to be questioned. With 1975 pressing down on us, every one of those teachings felt not like cruelty, but like rescue, like the last instructions before a storm. You did not argue with the instructions. You memorized them. You became them. So a woman like Ruth, who had borne everything and said nothing for 40 years, was not, in our eyes, a woman who had been ground down. She was a champion. She was the thing they held up to the rest of us. When her name was spoken from the platform, it was spoken with reverence, and every young sister in those folding chairs was meant to look at the coffin and understand that this enduring, this swallowing of one's whole self was the summit. Not a tragedy to be mourned, a standard to be met. They took a worn-through coat and they called it a banner. Let me step out of this for a moment before I take you any further, because I think you may already be in this story without knowing it. Somewhere in your life, perhaps more than once, the truest thing inside you tried to speak, and you called it selfishness, and you put it away to keep the peace in a house. I did the same. For 60 years I did the same. What I learnt far too late, when there was finally no one left to keep the peace for, I wrote down, every small piece of it, in the order I came to understand it. I called it the Freedom Years. There is an audio of it as well, read in my own voice, for the evenings when the eyes are tired. The link is in the first comment of this video, if any of what I am saying belongs to you. Now, back to where we were. It was an autumn afternoon when we buried Ruth. 1973. She had not been ill in any way the congregation discussed out loud. She had simply worn through, the way a coat wears through at the elbow, in a place no one is looking, until one day there is nothing left of the cloth. She was in her late 50s. I have done the arithmetic many times since, sitting alone, and every time it comes out the same, and every time it frightens me more. The Kingdom Hall was full. The folding chairs were set out in their rows, the brown carpet faded pale down the centre aisle where 10,000 feet had walked it, and the casket was at the front, plain, closed. An elder gave the talk, and it had the same shape it always had. A few minutes on the resurrection, a few minutes on the faithfulness of those who keep their place and wait on Jehovah, and then near the end, Ruth, Sister Ruth, who was a fine example to the younger sisters, who was submissive, who never complained. I was crying. I want to be honest about that. I loved her, in the small, frightened way an 18-year-old had been allowed to love the one woman who stood near her. And I was 28 now, and I was crying for her. And it was then that Raymond leaned over to me. He saw my tears. He took them, I think, for something tender, and he put his mouth near my ear, and he said the 3 words I have carried for 50 years. He said, "That is faithfulness. That is faithfulness." He was not unkind when he said it. You must hold on to that, because it is the hardest part. He said it the way you would point out something beautiful to a child you loved, so she would not miss it. He was looking at the coffin of a woman who had been worn down to nothing by 40 years of swallowing herself, and a hall full of people had just called that nothing by the name of faith. And my husband, who loved me, leaned close and gave me the lesson, gently, as a gift, as if to say, "Do you see, Dorothy? Do you see what is being asked of you? Do you see the prize?" For 50 years I thought those words were about Ruth. I thought he was praising the dead. I understand now that he was not talking about Ruth at all. He was talking about me. He was showing me the shape of the life I was to live, and the death I was to die, and the few words that would be said over me, and he believed, with his whole certain heart, that he was handing me the most precious thing a man could hand his wife. He was teaching me what to want. And the terrible thing, the thing it took me until I was nearly 80 to see, is that it worked. It worked. 23 years later, in 1996, the elders disfellowshipped my daughter Lisa. She was 28, the same age I had been at that funeral. And I shunned her. I closed my own child out of my life for 28 years, no calls, no letters, an empty chair. And the whole time there was a voice inside me telling me that this terrible thing was the faithful thing. I did not know I was quoting my husband. I did not know I had learned it over a coffin in 1973. But I had. He had set it in me like a stone, and I built the rest of my life on top of it. And I passed it on. This is the part I am least able to forgive. In the years after that funeral, younger sisters began to come to me the way I had once gone to Ruth. They came in tears with hard marriages because I was an elder's wife and I was steady and I never complained. And I took out my little card, Ephesians 5 verse 22, and I told them what had been told to me. I told them to submit. I told one young woman, I can still see her face, that there had once been a sister named Ruth, a fine example, who bore everything and was honoured for it at the end. I did to her exactly what had been done to me, and I called it love. And some part of me always knew I was lying. I live alone now in the house on Chestnut Street. Raymond is buried in the cemetery outside Mifflinburg, and I tended him to the end, and I grieve him. The real him, the soft man the truth never once let him become. The meetings go on 3 streets away without me. The witnesses who raised their children beside mine cross the road when they see me on the sidewalk. My son Mark, who is an elder now himself, shuns me, gently, for my own good, the way I once shunned his sister. He sends a card at the correct times. He does not call. I have come in my old age to feel from the inside the exact thing I once did from the outside, and there is no lesson in the world worth what that costs. There is a word for what was done to me, and for what I then did to others. It is not a word we were permitted to use. We called it headship. We called it faithfulness. We called it the loving provision of Jehovah's organization. It took me until I was an old woman to be able to say the plain word out loud in my own kitchen with no one to hear it. The word is control. 3 words my husband gave me over a coffin, and underneath them the whole time, one word he could not see, because no one had ever let him see it either. And I want to say this clearly, the way I have learned to say things clearly only now, at the end. Raymond was not a cruel man. Ruth's Harold was not a monster. The elder who gave that talk believed every word of it. They were not the machine's operators. They were its product, every one of them, handed the same lessons 40 years before by people who had been handed them in their turn. My husband whispered that a worn-out woman in a box was the summit of a wife's life, and he did it tenderly, because tenderness was all he had to give, and the only shape it had ever been poured into was that one. He was as captive as I was. He simply died, still believing the walls were the sky. A woman wrote to me not long ago and said that her husband had never once raised his voice, never struck her, never strayed, and that this was why it had taken her 70 years to understand that something had been wrong her whole life. She had no villain to point to, and so she thought she had no right to her own grief. I want to answer her here, because I know exactly what she means. The absence of a monster is not the absence of a harm. Sometimes the gentlest hand is the one that holds the door, because it never once thinks to ask whether the door should be closed at all. Ruth never complained, neither did I, and look what the not complaining cost the both of us. If you are still young enough to choose, and you are younger than I am, all of you are younger than I am, then hear an old woman who learned this 50 years too late. If you have ever been told that your silence is your virtue, if you have ever been handed a worn-out woman as a thing to become, if you have ever felt the truest part of you go quiet to keep a good and certain man comfortable in a quiet room, I see you. I was you. I waited until I was nearly 80 to begin a life that belonged to me, and I cannot get back the years I gave away, not one of them. But the years in front of you are still yours. That is the only thing I am certain of anymore, and it is everything. I lost mine to later. You do not have to. If you stayed with me all the way to here, thank you. The first winter I lived alone, I wrote down everything I had learned far too late, in the plainest words I had, so it would not die with me. That became the Freedom Years. The link is in the first comment of this video if you want the thing I made. And that is the whole of it. It is late for me. It is not too late for you.